Hello everyone. Today's lesson is on comparing fractions. And before we get into comparing fractions, you need to know that it's not completely new. We have already used the comparing symbols, greater than, less than, equal to compare numbers that we already know. For example, I could say 532 is greater than 327. Or I might say that 23 is less than 32. So you've already used the comparison symbols and you already know a little bit about fractions. Today's lesson, we're just going to put those two things together. Instead of comparing two numbers, we're just going to compare two fractions to see which one is greater than the other one. So let's jump right into it. Our first example shows us that AJ has 3/6 of his homework done. Yuki only finished 4/6 of hers. So they went ahead and they built these two fractions for us. So we could see, here's AJ's 3/6, 1, 2, 3 out of 6 total equal parts. This would be the whole assignment. He's only done 3/6. Yuki has 4/6 finished, and we're trying to figure out who has finished a greater part of their homework. So when we compare those two with the fraction strips, we want to see which one has most of it done, which one is closest to the end of having most of it done. And if we want to draw a line, sometimes that makes it even easier to see. And we can very easily see that Yuki has finished most of his homework. So we would say that 4/6 is greater than 3/6. Using the fraction models, we can very easily see that. Now there is another little shortcut way that I'm going to show you on each time today, and it's not required, but it is another way that you can show comparing fractions. It is called cross multiplying. So if we ignore all of those pictures for a minute, pretend we didn't have those there, we would multiply the diagonal numbers. So 6 times 3 is 18. And 6 times 4 is 24. Ignore these fractions down here for a minute now. 24 and 18, if we were going to compare those two numbers, we would say that 24 is greater than 18. So that means the fraction that's under this is the greater fraction. So if I used a different color, that's another way of saying 4/6 is greater than 3/6. Here's another one with fraction tiles. Sasha places 2/3 cup of fruit into a bowl. She places 5/6 cup of nuts into another bowl. Are there more fruit or nuts? Use the fraction tiles to compare. So I've already put out the thirds and I've already put out the sixths, and I chose those because I looked at the question and I saw 2/3, so that tells me I need to use the 1/3 fraction tiles, and I know I'm going to need to use 2 of those. So let's go ahead and put 2 of these fraction tiles touching there. It's really important when we're comparing fractions to make sure that we have them starting at the exact same place here. Okay, so those are lined up. And then I need 5 of the 1/6 tiles to represent the amount of nuts that she put into this mix. So we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, using the fraction tiles, we can easily see that these 6 is a greater amount than the 2/3. So we're going to go ahead and write 5/6, that's this one here, is greater than 2/3. But their question wanted to know, are there more fruit or nuts? Well, the 6 were for the nuts, so I'm going to answer that question. There are more nuts. To try that cross multiplying now, pretend we didn't have the picture here. I would say 6 times 2 is 12. 3 times 5 is 15. Ignore the fraction stuff down here. If we were looking at just 15 versus 12, 15 is greater than 12. So that tells us that the fraction underneath this fraction, is greater than that fraction if you didn't have the picture there to help you. Let's look at another one using fraction tiles, because the fraction tiles definitely are very helpful. We're going to use the greater than, less than, or equal to symbol. If you forget those, because sometimes kids do forget those, remember that the larger area gets gobbled up. The wide part of the mouth, think of it as an alligator mouth, is always going to gobble up the greater part. So let's see, we have 1/3 on the top, that's representing our first fraction, versus 2/3 on the bottom. Notice they're lined up at exactly the same starting place. Which one takes up more? Remember, this side would be if it was one whole one, but we don't have one whole one. This bottom one has more, and that is representing 2/3. So we would say 1/3 is less than 2/3, because see, the wide part here is gobbling up our larger fraction. If we wanted to show this, let's say you didn't have the picture here and we had to compare 1/3 versus 2/3. Let's use that cross multiplying trick. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 1 is 3. Ignore the fractions down here for a minute now. 3 is, how would you describe when you're 3 versus 6? 3 is less than 6. So that means this whole fraction is less than that whole fraction. Isn't that a great shortcut? Let's try another one. This one is using a number line and fraction strips to compare 1/4 and 1/3. So they divided the top number line. Notice they both start at exactly the same point, and they both end at exactly the same point. Whenever you are comparing fractions on a number line, they must start and they must end at exactly the same points, or it's not going to work for you. So the top one, they divided into 4 equal parts. You can see 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. The bottom one, they divided into thirds. So they're larger parts, but there aren't as many. They wanted to know which one is greater, so they found here's 1/4 on that number line. Here's 1/3 on this number line. Let's see. We have 1/4 versus 1/3. Which one is closer to one whole one? So sometimes when I'm going to try to decide which one's closer to the whole one, I like to draw a line down where they are. So here's my 1/4, and if I use a different color here's my 1/3, where does that land? I'll go bottom up, there we go. Now you can easily see this pink 1/3 line is closer to the one whole one than the 1/4 one. That one's closer to 0. So the one that is closer to your one whole is going to be your greater fraction. 1/3 is our greater fraction. Whoops, I can't write like that. 1/3 is the greater fraction. If we were going to try using our cross multiplying way, up here at the top we have 1/4 versus 1/3. I would say 4 times 1 equals 4. 3 times 1 equals 3. Now you can ignore the fractions down there for a minute and just look at a 3 versus a 4. If you were going to compare the number 3 versus 4, 3 is less than 4. So that means that 1/4 is less than 1/3, and we figured that out down there. Just another way of solving it. Here we have two fractions and they put them on the same number line for us. They were comparing 3/6 to 4/6, and when they're on the same number line, that makes it extra easy because then we can see whichever one is closest to one whole is the greater fraction. And in this instance, 4/6 is the greater fraction. I do want to show you it using the cross multiplying method, just so it's another example for you. 6 times 3 is 18. 6 times 4 is 24. Ignore the fractions at the bottom for a moment. If you were just going to compare the number 24 to the number 18, 24 is greater than 18. So that means the fraction under the 24 is greater than the fraction under the 18. 4/6 is greater than 3/6. And we can definitely see that on our number line as well. One more practice one, and then I'll give you some on your own. We're comparing 1/4 to 1/6. So here are the two fractions written at the bottom. That circle, we're going to fill in the symbol that's missing. So it's either going to be 1/4 is less than 1/6, 1/4 is greater than 1/6, or 1/4 is equal. Well, we can tell that they're not equal because remember, if they were equal, they would line up in exactly the same spot. Are these two lining up in exactly the same spot on their number lines? They are not. So I'm just going to draw a little line down. Here's my 1/6. Here's my 1/4. Which of my lines is closer to the whole one? Remember, over here would be our whole one. See, one whole, one whole. Which of those lines is closest? It is the 1/4. 1/4 is greater than 1/6. If you wanted to solve this without the number line, 1/4, 1/6. We could use that cross multiplication strategy. 4 times 1 is 4. 6 times 1 is 6. Ignore the fractions at the bottom for a moment. If we just had 6 versus 4, 6 is greater than 4, so that means 1/4 is greater than 1/6, and that's what we found at the bottom. All right, boys and girls, that concludes this lesson. I'm going to give you some practice examples for you to do on your own. Take your time, do your best, and we'll see how you do from there.